So, we finally made it to the end of this little GBA trilogy. Legacy of Goku, I made it pretty clear that I don't like that game at all. In fact, if I ever did a top 10 worst games I've ever played, that would easily make the list. Then we tackled Legacy of Goku 2, my entry point into the trilogy, and in my opinion, it's a great game to have for the GBA. Definitely a must-have. And now we finally make it to the final chapter that, well, I have a feeling many people didn't even know existed due to it not retaining the Legacy of Goku branding. Well, don't let the name change make you overlook this game. If you enjoyed Legacy of Goku 2, then you're gonna like this. Though ironically, much like the first game, Boo's Fury would elude me for a while since much like Legacy of Goku, this game used to have problems running on an emulator for me back in the early 2000s. Though in this case it was even crueler, probably an anti-piracy thing, but still, it's cruel, damn it. Letting you play the first few minutes and preventing you from going any further? Yeah, so a bit of a hard series to get into if you didn't have the physical versions. But nonetheless, that isn't a problem for me anymore, and unlike the first game, this was worth the wait. So we now finally made it to the Majin Buu portion of Dragon Ball Z. And much like the second game, it's an RPG Zelda-esque like retelling of it where you play as one of 5 different characters throughout the events of that era of the series, fighting enemies and iconic characters to level up, grow stronger, and progress the story. Much like Legacy of Goku 2, in terms of its plot and progression, it's a pretty faithful adaptation that only takes a few liberties to pad out the gameplay. And once again, it does a great job with the little things like fan service, and making it fun to explore and interact with this world. So I won't go too deep into the plot or the side stuff this time, but if you're a fan then you'll enjoy what it has to offer. Especially when you'll even play as one-time specific characters like Videl for story progression. Just goes to show there was so much more thought and care that was put into this game. In terms of gameplay though, Webfoot Technologies would once again step it up a bit and refine the mechanics and look of the game even further. Though it might not seem as big of a jump in comparison to Legacy of Goku 2, since that game just improved so much more to begin with. But nonetheless, the new stuff they did introduce were welcome additions, like a block button. It's actually kind of amazing that it took 3 games to implement this feature, but you know, I appreciate the little things in video games like this, and Boo's Fury is all about that. It might not feel like too much has changed on the surface due to how similar the 2 games are, but it adds up and by the end of it, it comes to feel like a major improvement even if they both feel like the same game. So whenever somebody tries to describe these games, many will refer to it as a Zelda clone with an RPG element minus the dungeon aspect. Well, Boo's Fury would double down on the RPG elements and include stuff like equipable items to boost your character's stats, and a currency that enemies will drop that you can spend on replenishables and gear, among other things. As well as now when you level up, you now get to choose where you can put those skill points in one of the 3 slots to upgrade your character, where once again it's strength, energy, and endurance. For some, this aspect alone is a huge improvement because now you can essentially make each of the 5 playable characters play how you want them to. For me, and keep in mind this is just personal preference, and I do it manually anyway, so it's not like it's a knock against this new mechanic or anything like that, but I do kind of prefer when games automatically make a character's stats different from each other. It's a similar issue I had with Resident Evil Revelations 2's Raid Mode, where each character essentially played the same, and you had to manually make them unique yourself. Here, you can make Goku, Gohan, Goten, Vegeta, and Trunks have all the same stats, and I think that can rob a little bit of the uniqueness of each character. Now, to be fair, they do have their own special energy beams, so that is something. And like I said, this is really a me problem, not the game's fault or even an issue for probably most. And again, like I said, I can manually make them different, but I figured I'd mention it for the hell of it, as I can't be the only one out there that feels this way. Now, one of the new main mechanics introduced is the ability to do fusion with specific characters. Basically everyone but Gohan. It's not that big of a game changer, but it can give you an edge in battle since, much like the Super Transformation, you'll get stronger and enemies will go down easier. Though considering you distribute your stats whenever you want now, it can also lead to Boo's Fury being the easiest in the series. Sure, the game starts you at supposedly level 40 to level 50, but that doesn't mean the game is harder because of it. Oh no, in 1, I was dying constantly, in 2, maybe a few times if I was underleveled and only when a boss would sneak up on me, but here, not even once. Which admittedly is probably one of the game's biggest weakness depending on who you are. If you're looking for a challenge, then you're probably not going to find it here unless you're actively not using your skill points, which you're going to get a lot of since grinding is here once again. But unlike last time where grinding usually meant it could take a while to go up a few levels, that's not really the case here. In fact, it's the opposite. You'll be leveling up like it's nothing in Boo's Fury. Like potentially half an hour grind fest could lead to like 20 levels. And once again, the game does that level cap barricade stuff, so the game forces you into having to do this level grind stuff again since once again, you're gonna be bouncing back and forth between characters and there will be points where you won't play as someone for a while. Then you'll be playing as them again and they haven't grown even a bit. Legacy 2 did try to remedy this by boosting your levels by a stage or 2 if there was a time skip, but it could still be a problem at points. And here, it could sometimes feel even worse. There really should have been a mechanic in these games to make up for it, because while it's a lot quicker to level up, it's still a pain in the ass at points, especially if you don't like to grind in your RPGs. But when grinding is an RPG's biggest misstep, well, I think I can overlook it as long as it isn't too bad. And thankfully, 2 and 3 are far from the worst I've ever experienced in gaming when it comes to this. So yeah, I mean, I know this look is a little bit shorter compared to 1 and 2, but there's just not a lot of stuff I can really mention here since Boo's Fury borrows so much from Legacy of Goku 2, just with a refined coat of paint. And you know what? That's not a bad thing. 2 raised the bar so much more after the disaster that was the first game, and honestly, there's not that much more the team could have done to really improve it without making it a completely different game, or making it a worse game. Boo's Fury is very much the Mario Galaxy 2 of this trilogy. If you played Legacy of Goku 2, well, it's just more of that, just with a slightly better presentation, and slightly more gameplay mechanics to make it feel a little better, but still familiar. In fact, I would recommend if you had the time, play these 2 games back to back as the transition is pretty seamless. In fact, in some ways, it almost feels like it's just one big game, and you know what? That's fine by me. Another must-have for the GBA, and another example that shows a Dragon Ball game can be more than just fighting games.